Hello, little baby rams. So, just to touch base, we've already talked a little bit about the Boston Tea Party, but this video, we're going to cover the rest of it. We're going to finish talking about the Boston Tea Party. We're going to cover our essential question. We're going to touch base back on it, and hopefully, you'll be able to have your notes done by the end of this video. So, as a recap, we already talked about after the Boston Massacre. We talked about what started it, which was ice and snowballs being thrown. We talked about how many people died, and we talked about how the conditions were after the Boston Massacre happened. So here's a little touch base on it. Go ahead and look at it. Pause right here if you need to catch up these notes. If you were gone, go ahead and pause right here for this slide, but we are going to move on. So after the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act was imposed. And as a reminder, but the Tea Act, it happened in 1773. It allowed the British East India Company to sell tea to the colonies for cheaper and for a lot less work for the British. However, the colonists were still being taxed on it. And they ended up taxing over 1.2 million pounds of tea. Now, that's a lot because the colonists didn't want this brand of tea. They wanted their own brand of tea, and that's not how the British wanted to be fair with it. So what they did was they protested the Tea Act. They protested the British East India Tea Company, and they smuggled in a whole bunch of Dutch tea, which was their preference. And this caused the British East India Trading Company Tea Company to go bankrupt with a surplus, which is an increase in tea. The Tea Act kept going. The Tea Act kept causing issues. So tea smuggling in the colonies increased, obviously. And then John Hancock and Sam Adams stood behind no taxation without representation. Stood behind the phrase, which meant you cannot tax us without hearing our voices. They stood by that as the Tea Act progressed. As the Tea Act was progressing at the end, there was this group called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were made up by these 5 dudes: Benedict Arnold, Patrick Henry, Paul Revere, Sam Adams, and John Hancock. Now, what they did was they were a big rally group for freedom. They were a big rally group for colonial freedom and for all of the colonists to be free from British rule. They held rallies to protest tea ships, and they surrounded to not pay the tea taxes. They said, we're not going to pay these taxes because you keep forcing us. It was a group of colonial merchants and tradesmen, which meant that this was a group of working class people that wanted to stand up against the wrong that they were feeling from British ruling. What started off, now, one big part of the Sons of Liberty was Governor Hutchinson ordered a tea tariff to be paid and for the tea to be unloaded into colonial harbors. But the colonists refused, and then Hutchinson never got paid for it. So this really set off some spark, and this set off some controversy, and this really laid down the framework of the Sons of Liberty being a huge freedom movement and freedom group within the colonists. Now let's actually talk about the Boston Tea Party. Boston Tea Party, as you guys know, was when people dressed up as Native Americans and threw a whole bunch of tea off board. But the members of the Boston Tea Party were the Sons of Liberties. So that freedom group came in, and they disguised themselves as Native Americans. Now, why that is a controversial thing is because you got to think about it. Yes, what they did, they were doing it for freedom, but at the cost of a whole another minority group, because the Native Americans were then blamed for it. They boarded the docked ships, and they threw 342 chests of tea into the water, turning all of the water around them and underneath them this dark brown as the tea started to get ruined by the water in the ocean. After that happened, some colonists approved and some did not. Some were like, yeah, let's go, freedom, I'm into it. Other ones, like George Washington, were like, that's not okay. We cannot justify any of what we're doing with that, because then that makes us like them. No one was hurt, and the colonists cleaned up after everything. So it was pretty, all in all, it was annoying and it was a waste of money. But King George III saw it as a massive act against Britain, which they then enacted the Intolerable Acts, which we've already talked about a little bit. But the Intolerable Acts were a bunch of acts that the colonists said, oh, these are absolutely intolerable. to be a part of. These are absolutely intolerable to deal with. Also called the Coercive Acts because they were made to coerce the colonists into following British rule. Boston Harbor was closed until the Tea Party was paid for. Massachusetts Constitution was ended, and and it also ended any kind of free election. Basically, martial law was instilled in Massachusetts, which means the military ruled all of Massachusetts. They required colonists to just let British troops come in on demand. British troops were allowed to walk into anybody's house and say, yeah, I live here now. I own here. You have to feed me. You have to house me. And that was completely legal. And the most important one was that it limited religion. This limited a lot of colonial religion to Protestant, which upset a lot of the Catholic faith Christians that had moved to the colonies to seek freedom of religion. So everything that they had moved from British to the colonies for had kind of gone up in smoke with the Intolerable Acts. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Intolerable Acts later on. We're going to make sure we get some other notes finished up. However, pause this video where you need to, finish up, and let's get these notes going, and I will see you in the next activity.